Good afternoon. We are doing it live, doing more at 4 weekday afternoons. We get right down to business with the news-driven hour right after Ben Shapiro and just before the 790 KABC News Blitz with Randy Wang at 5. It's Mottek On Money, live on the air on 790 KABC, streaming live online worldwide at KABC.com, and your on-demand Mottek On Money podcast, KABC.com, Apple, iTunes, and all of your favorite podcast platforms. Stocks moving higher today off the session's high. The S&P 500 and the Dow did post a back-to-back weekly loss coming ahead of the November 5th presidential election on Tuesday. We did see bond yields moving up. They've been a concern in the run-up to the election, impacting the financial markets. The Dow coming in for a closing gain today of 289 points. The S&P 500 moving up 23.5. The NASDAQ, meanwhile, gained 145 points. For the week, though, the Dow was down 0.2%. The S&P 500 down 1.4%. And the NASDAQ was down 1.5% for the week, its biggest weekly loss since early September, while snapping 7 straight weeks of gains. Stocks ended the day higher, but off the session's highs. The S&P 500, by the way, logged its biggest weekly drop in 2 months, despite the gains today. And long-dated government debt selling off today, despite a weaker-than-expected October jobs report, which took the spotlight an hour ahead of the opening bell today, sending the 10-year note yield to a 4-month closing high. That's the one that impacts the fixed-rate mortgage rates and is back to 4.39%. Big week for gold, hitting a record high this week. A volatile trading week for gold saw prices climb to record highs and also saw their biggest one-day drop since July. Gold settled down today, down about $3 to $2,746.20 an ounce after hitting a record high above $2,800 earlier this week. Silver, by the way, is hovering just below $33 an ounce. Now let's talk about oil, finishing higher for the session as concerns about risks to supplies in the Middle East rose. Axios, that news website, citing 2 unnamed Israeli sources this week, reporting this week that Israeli intelligence suggested Iran is planning a major retaliatory strike on Israel. We're watching those developments very, very closely. And in the meantime, we did get the earnings news from a couple of the oil giants today. Shares of Chevron moving to a 3-month high today after the oil giant reported third-quarter earnings and production that beat analysts' expectations and announced record returns to shareholders. Chevron shares moving up today by more than $4 at $153 and change. And ExxonMobil with its third-quarter earnings showing a profit beat that offset a revenue miss. ExxonMobil shares closing lower by nearly $2 at $114 and change. The jobs report today, analysts say, was skewed by hurricanes and a strike at Boeing. And this, of course, coming just before Election Day. The Trump campaign called the report a catastrophe and said it was evidence of how badly Vice President Harris has managed the economy, along with President Biden. We also heard from Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen today in the Biden administration, attributing the lower numbers to temporary disruptions. Meanwhile, the Chicago Business Barometer, known as the Chicago PMI, moved lower in October to a 5-month low. And also another manufacturing index moved lower as well in October, according to the Institute for Supply Management, the 7th straight month below the threshold for growth and the lowest reading for that one since July of 2023. Construction spending did inch higher in September to a 4-month high. Meanwhile, many Americans remain concerned about the economy, according to a recent Gallup poll indicating a majority of folks feel worse off than they were 4 years ago. A bank rate analysis showing prices have increased by more than 20% since February of 2020. Inflation, of course, a big part of the consumer confidence out there, or lack thereof. I'll discuss the latest jobs report and the economy and the whole works later this hour with prominent Los Angeles area economist Dr. Robert Kleinhans, principal at Kleinhans Economics. Also, Grover Norquist, the president of Americans for Tax Reform, will be joining us on the jobs report, taxes, and the upcoming election. But first, joining us live now, the one and only Ben Stein. Yep, economic and political commentator, economist, attorney, author of numerous books. Yep, that Ben Stein, game show host of Win Ben Stein's Money, actor too, playing himself in the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off in one of the most famous scenes in American cinema. And, of course, we do the occasional Frankenstein segment here on Mottek on Money. And I'd like to say good afternoon now to Ben Stein.
It's my pleasure to be here, sir. How are you?
Wonderful. I hope you had a great Halloween. Oftentimes we speak on Halloween for Frankenstein. We missed you yesterday, but today we are live on the air on November 1st. Happy November, Ben Stein, just days before the the presidential election with the economy very much in focus. I know you'd love to talk about politics and economics, so take it from the top and give us your view of the world here at the moment.
Well, the economy of the United States is extremely strong by almost every statistical metric. But if you talk to individuals, and that's all I get to talk to, I don't get to talk to large crowds and ask them their opinions. They are apprehensive. They're scared. There's a lot of fear, a really a lot of fear in the air, and I don't know what to make of it exactly. But I think here in our beloved Southern California, which we all love so much, and it's like to me, paradise. The real problem is housing. We have a really serious crisis of housing. Wages, incomes, capital, assets have not appreciated anywhere near as fast as the price of housing, including purchasing and renting. And this creates extremely uncomfortable situations for families, and it creates a fear and dissatisfaction. There's a really serious problem in the minds and spirits of Californians. And I was about to say young Californians, but I think it's true of Californians of just about any age.
Fortunately, we have that great weather today, and the Dodgers, of course, celebrating the win in the World Series. So L.A. is feeling great right now. But you're right to note housing, and that brings us to inflation. Once again, certainly affordable housing is a huge issue here in the Los Angeles area. We had Steve Forbes on this program 24 hours ago talking about inflation. And, of course, inflation very much a subject here heading to the election next Tuesday. So what about inflation here, Ben Stein?
I don't see any easy way out of it, and I don't see any way out of it at all at this point. A long time ago, when there was a thought that if you tax people less, that would somehow cut down on the inflation. That was a concept invented by a very nice guy named Mundell and Laffer, two nice guys, Mundell and Laffer. It had no statistical data to back it up, still doesn't. But they said if you lowered taxes, that would somehow lower prices. It did not work. We have had a great long run of prosperity, but we have not had any good effect on prices. And I don't know when it's going to end. It always does end. Everything in economics always ends at some point. But when will this inflation end? I don't know. I do know, I had lunch today with a young woman, very lovely young woman, who works for the Steins, my wife and me, and she is a very talented nurse, and her husband is a quite highly placed gentleman in the sheriff's department, and it's astonishing how much money they earn, considering what people in such positions used to earn, and yet they still cannot afford what they would consider adequate housing, and I don't know when it's going to end. When I talk to the people who work for my wife and me about their housing situations, it's a pretty darn glum situation. And I don't know what the solution is. I don't know why we have gone from a city that used to have remarkably reasonably priced housing to a city that now has just astonishingly high prices. I mean, just amazingly high prices. And when will this slumber end? I don't know. It is a scary situation.
It's a huge issue, and obviously driving around, you see what the homeless situation is here in Los Angeles, at or near all-time highs.
My dear friend, Frank, that is a situation so bad that I can hardly even wrap my poor aged brain around it, because of course, it's a terrible situation for those who are homeless. Obviously, that's true. But it impacts the whole mentality of everyone. I mean, I'm a person who, by most standards, is not poor, but every time I drive by little knots of homeless people, I get terrified, and I think, how long till I'm one of them? I don't exactly see the path to that, because I already own quite a number of homes. I guess if I just had one of them, I wouldn't be homeless. But somehow I have nightmares about homelessness, and I think a great many Californians do. Homelessness is a curse, and I don't know how we make it any better. I really don't. The people who are homeless are not former presidents of IBM. They're drug addicts. They're alcoholics. They've got serious personality problems, and yet somehow we see, at least I see, myself being one of those homeless people. I mean, if you see them around all the time, you get to feel pretty bad. Just like if you see lots of people around who are wounded in wartime, you begin to think you're going to turn out to be one of them too.
Well, it is heartbreaking, and I'm sure people coming in and out of downtown Los Angeles saw what's going on there. People think Skid Row is one street, but it's about 60 blocks of the downtown Los Angeles area. And, of course, homelessness is throughout the entire Los Angeles area. And by the way, and I do the Amazing Stories on Skid Row program here on 790 KABC, which airs on Saturday morning here. And the fact is, nowadays you have people with full-time jobs and cars who are homeless. So affordable housing, getting back to your point earlier, Ben Stein, is certainly something that is critical and obviously reflects the inflation situation that we've seen here for quite some time. Now, the stock market is supposed to be a...
I'm sorry, go ahead. And it reflects it back as if we were in a fun house looking at a fun house mirror. It makes us, even those of us who are pretty old, as I am, and you're not, but I am, and who have had the steady jobs for a pretty long time and have some savings, it's terrifying. It is terrifying.
Yeah.
It's just absolutely terrifying. We think we're going to be one of them. Our families are going to be one of them. What are we going to tell our wives when we come home from work one day after we get a call from the bank saying we're overdrawn by a huge amount? What are we going to think about that? What are we going to think? What are we going to tell our wives? What are we going to tell our children? This homelessness is just a horrifying, horrifying situation.
Yeah, well, I look forward to continuing the conversation on that important subject with you, and I know you can certainly make a difference in a number of ways, Ben Stein, with your resources, so let's talk about that at some point. In the meantime, the stock market is supposed to be forward-looking. What does the stock market see here? We've hit record highs recently. Gold, by the way, also hit a record high this week, above 2,800. That usually reflects concerns about inflation as well as geopolitics, and certainly a lot going on that front. Give us your view of what you see ahead. Are we for the economy and for the market?
My dear friend, I have never. I will be 80 in about 3 weeks. I've lived through a lot of elections. I've never seen people so scared about the election. I've seen people apprehensive. I've seen people angry. I've seen people militant. Wifey and I marched in the snows of New Hampshire for Gene McCarthy, and I think it was 1968. Be clean for Gene, as we called it. Then I was a Democrat. I would not even consider doing that now. But anyway, but we had hope that no matter who won, the country would go along being a perfectly fine, great country. Now people are scared that this isn't going to be America anymore. And you asked about the price of gold. The price of gold is not, I think, a reflection of interest rates. It's a reflection of just a basic solidity of America. And I think people are scared that the foundations of America are crumbling, and it has a lot to do with the thought that there are certain very large entities in a society that are against the Constitution, that are against a free society, that are against law enforcement the way we commonly understand it to be. I think we have a large group of, I hate to say this, people who do not appreciate very much our great America and are willing to see it torn apart. And that scares people, makes them want to hold gold.
On the air live with Ben Stein for our occasional Frank and Stein conversation, live with us here now on 790 KABC, Mottek On Money, and a lot of geopolitical concerns, and certainly all of a sudden on the radar screen you have North Korean troops in Russian uniforms along the border with Russia and Ukraine. That's something I wanted to ask you about. That's big news. And then, of course, the reports that say Iran might hit Israel again after Israel struck Iran last week. And give us an update here on your view of those two hot spots.
Astonishing that North Korea is now sending not only troops, They're tough. They're tough fighters, but also weapons to Russia. We would have thought that Russia would be among the absolutely top makers in terms of quality and quantity of weapons and ammunition. Apparently not. Apparently they need to get some from North Korea as well. That's quite a shock. Fighting ability, the Ukrainians have defied all expectations. I think Mr. Putin must be absolutely floored down to his socks that this a very important, large part of Russia, but basically a part of Russia, has been able, not entirely, but largely to fight the Russians to a standstill. That's shocking. Iran. When I was a child, the Iranians were our pals. I remember very well meeting the Shah and his wife at a party at the White House a long time ago. She's like a very affable fellow. Now, Iran is a really dangerous place. They have a lot of money idiotically freed up for them by the current administration. They are able to build and modernize very, very powerful rockets. If they start dumping them on Israel, boy, there's going to be trouble. There's going to be so much trouble. If there's one country in the world you do not want to try to push around, it's Israel. But the Iranians are willing to take a chance, I think. And a very, very smart friend of mine said, the day you see a mushroom cloud coming over any part of Israel is the day you see Tehran turned into one big glass parking lot. And that's going to be a terrible situation for the whole world.
On the air live with Ben Stein. Ben, it's always great to speak with you. There's no old on this program, by the way. It's young or young at heart, and you fall into that category. And we're going to be hearing more about trade and tariffs. Didn't hear too much about trade during this administration, but if President Trump gets reelected, we're going to be talking more about tariffs and so forth, something that you lectured about, of course, in the famous movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And you're an expert on all of that. And now, as this always happens when you're on the air, people wonder, is that really you, Ben Stein? And they want you to take the role, please. Yeah.
Bueller, Fry, anyone. And by the way, there's a reason tariffs are not a big issue anymore. Nobody really seriously disagrees about the tariff policy. Trump's is not that much different from Biden's. Nothing's going to change very much about that. But we should be producing more of our own oil, that's for sure.
All right, we'll look forward to your next lecture, Ben Stein. Thank you very, very much for taking the call this afternoon. It's always great to have you with us here. That is the one and only Ben Stein, of course. Yeah, you got it, Ben. Thank you very much for joining us here live on Frankenstein, Mottek on Money on 790 KABC. Mottek on Money continues here on 790 KABC. Good afternoon. Winning day for the stock market today, heading into the weekend. And what was otherwise a losing week, believe it or not, the Dow 289 points today to 42,052. The S&P 500 moved to 23 at 5,729. And the NASDAQ gained 145 to 18,240. Return of the bulls on Wall Street today. The yield in a 10-year note, meanwhile, getting back up there at 4.39%. That's the one that impacts the fixed-rate mortgage rates, which have been edging higher lately. Taking a look at some of the movers today, NVIDIA did gain by nearly $3, up $2.64 at $135 and change. Apple down $3 at $222.91. Super Microcomputer had a rough week, down another $3 today at $26.05 a share. Shares of DJT, the Donald J. Trump Media Company, down nearly $5 today to $30.56 a share, down 21% for the week, but still up 106% for the year and up 75% year to date. The price of oil up today, up 7 cents to $69.33 a barrel. Gold hit a record high this week, above $2,800 an ounce, closing down to $310 today to $2,746.20 an ounce after that one-day blowout we had earlier in the week. Silver down 22 cents at $32.58 an ounce. Checking Bitcoin now, we see Bitcoin had a big run this week, but now a pullback down to around 69,245. Ethereum hovering at around 2504, and Doge had a big run this week as well, right now at 16 cents. Oil stocks mixed today with earnings from Chevron and ExxonMobil coming in. Chevron shares rallying on its earnings report of more than $4 at $153 and change. ExxonMobil down $1.83 at $114.95. And now the latest news for you here on 790 KABC. Mottek On Money continues here on 790 KABC. Good afternoon. The big enchilada, the monthly economic reports, came out first thing this morning. That's the monthly jobs report we get from the Labor Department. In this case, it was for the month of October on this November 1st here. And it showed the payrolls increased by just 12,000 for the month of October, down sharply from September and below the estimates that came in at about 100,000. The nation's unemployment rate did hold steady at 4.1%. That was within the analysts' expectations. Now, the Labor Department noted that the Boeing strike likely subtracted about 44,000 jobs in the manufacturing sector, while hurricanes back east also likely held back the total. We also got some pretty minor, some major revisions, I should say, revisions lowering previously reported job creation totals by about 112,000 for August and September combined. Joining us live now on the job front, prominent Los Angeles area economist Dr. Robert Kleinhans, principal at Kleinhans Economics. Dr. Kleinhans, thank you very much for taking the call and give us your reaction to that jobs report we got today.
Thanks, Frank. Well, of course, the jobs report was disappointing if you look at the monthly numbers. And as you pointed out, there's some explanations in terms of the 12,000 job gain, which was well below expectations with the Boeing strike, what's happened with the hurricanes and the aftermath. If you take a look at the yearly numbers, I think it's a little bit more reassuring, especially when you put them into the context of other data that we've seen over the last few days relating to GDP, the rate of inflation, and so on. And just very briefly, you mentioned the unemployment rates held steady. If we take a look at jobs, non-farm jobs on a year-over-year basis, they were up 1.4%, and that's in line with what we've seen through the last part of this year. It was a little bit faster earlier this year, so that's good. GDP came in with a good number, 2.8%. We heard that inflation, based on the personal consumption expenditure index, was 2.1%. So all in all, we're still looking at a pretty solid performance on the part of the U.S. economy.
You think the Fed has achieved that soft landing? Remember, all of last year we were expecting a recession. Didn't happen last year or this year. But what about heading into 25?
Yeah, well, I'm starting to use the term Goldilocks economy, which was the term that we used in the years leading up to the pandemic. If you recall, that was the longest expansion on record for the U.S. economy, and it was marked by low inflation, favorable interest rates, low unemployment, and steady, but not extraordinarily high growth rates of GDP. So it's beginning to look like a Goldilocks economy as we go forward, barring any unforeseen surprises in the next several months or next year or so.
Or next week even, right?
Well, that's true. But, I think we need to bear in mind that the economy is slowing partly because the Fed still has its foot on the brake, right? It's had one rate cut, but we're expecting to see more. We've seen that other interest rates, like the yield on the 10-year, have increased rather than fallen, and even though the Fed has cut its policy rate, but that's partly the response of the markets to seeing strength in the economy, if you ask me. So I think as we leave 2024 and look ahead at 2025, we should count on GDP that's probably going to grow a little bit more slowly than it has this year. This year, we're probably looking at somewhere between 2.7 and 3%. We'll see a little bit slower growth next year. But in response to your point, I don't think a recession is in the offing. Soft landing, I think we've achieved it. Goldilocks might be the term we're using in the foreseeable future.
On there live with Dr. Robert Kleinhans, prominent Los Angeles area economist, principal at Kleinhans Economics. Give us an update on what you're seeing here in the Los Angeles area and in the state of California overall as far as the job picture and the economy is concerned.
Yeah, California and LA County are still, they're adding jobs and doing so at a pace that matches or surpasses the average pace of job growth. I like to look at the long run averages and compare current performance to that. And so for California, in the month of September, which is the latest data that we have on the state, job growth was 1.5% on a yearly basis. And the long-term growth rate for California's job market is about 1%. So that's good. The unemployment rate, as everybody probably knows, is 5.3%. It was in the month of September. And so while that appears to be high, when you compare that historically with the U.S. unemployment rate, it's right in the ballpark. There's normally somewhere around a 1.3% differential, with the California rate higher than the national rate. And here in Los Angeles County, the unemployment rate on a seasonally adjusted basis was somewhat higher, 5.8%. So these numbers are higher than they were a year ago, nowhere near the danger zone. But I have to point out that both California and LA County still haven't fully recovered the labor force losses that they saw during the pandemic. So this continues to be cause for concern. But we're seeing job growth happen across a wide array of industries. Nearly all the industries at the state level have added jobs on a year-over-year basis. So these are all good things, moving in the right direction, just not fast enough.
On the air live with economist Dr. Robert Kleinhans. Turning back to what you mentioned here about higher rates, despite the Fed cutting its benchmark rate by 0.5 percentage point recently, we have seen the benchmark bond yields move up, which impacts fixed-rate mortgage rates. They're getting up there again. The yield on the 10-year note at 4.39% here as of today, and that's impacting borrowing costs with home prices still at or near all-time highs here in the Los Angeles area. And we just had a big conversation with Ben Stein a moment ago about the housing situation, affordable housing or lack of affordable housing. What's your outlook on what's happening on the real estate scene with these mortgage rates now turning higher?
This has been a tough year, actually 2 tough years really for the housing market, not just here in Southern California, but all the state and U.S. And so I say that because we kind of have what I call triple trouble. We have high home prices, which mean high down payments. We have high interest rates by recent standards, and we have very lean inventory that really hasn't budged. And so those things taken together make for very weak sales. We've seen that for quite some time now across the Southern California region. But even so, we see that home prices continue to edge up. That's because the housing market is as tight as it is. So yes, higher mortgage rates continue to hammer away at affordability. That's a real challenge. I guess we need to remind ourselves that when the Fed enacts policy rate cuts, they take time to work their way through the economy, and they encounter a whole variety of other forces, one of which I mentioned before, which is that the strength of the economy can tend to prop up interest rates, as we've seen with the 10-year yield. So one would hope and expects that the Fed's going to continue to cut rates, that as we get into 2025, there should be some mortgage rate relief. And that not only will interest rate relief more generally, and that will not only help housing, but other interest rate sensitive segments of the economy, which would be very much welcome, especially for those people who are in that industry and are in the process of trying to buy a home.
All right. Let me ask you an important question here. Despite on paper, certainly, as you noted, the economy looks pretty good, despite kind of a mixed messages we got today based on the latest readings on manufacturing and services. But many people still remain concerned about the economy, according to a recent Gallup poll indicating that a majority of Americans feel worse off than they were 4 years ago, according to a bank rate analysis. I know you attend a lot of business conferences, as I do, and what's going on here?
Well, it is and has been the case that consumers have been reporting, dissatisfaction or lack of confidence in the economy in these surveys, and yet we see that consumer spending, which makes up 2/3 of the economy, continues to advance at a good clip. So, the whole issue of inflation, which was something that we as a nation have not really had to worry about for more than a decade, really much more than a decade, until 2022, when inflation got to the point where the Fed had to act. That was kind of a new terrain for many people who are here, operating in the economy right now. So I think that's one source of dissatisfaction. I think, however, that people and households continue to spend, which means that on the one hand, they're saying one thing, but on the other hand, they're doing another thing. And so I like to
here we go.
pay closer
Here we go
attention
into
to
the
what
holiday
they
season,
do
and we
as
get
opposed to what
the
they see.
credit cards ready. We're November 1st here, heading into the holiday season. As always, Dr. Robert Kleinhans, thank you very much for that thorough assessment of all things on the economy, including the big jobs report we got today. I look forward to seeing you at upcoming conferences as well. That's Los Angeles area economist Dr. Robert Kleinhans, principal at Kleinhans Economics, live with us here on Mottek On Money on 790 KABC. Mottek On Money continues here on 790 KABC. Good afternoon. Congratulations to the Dodgers. Great event there in downtown Los Angeles today, celebrating the Dodgers winning the World Series. The jobs report out today, the economy, taxes, all big issues as we head to the presidential election on Tuesday. And joining us live now is Grover Norquist, the president of Americans for Tax Reform. Grover Norquist, thank you very much for coming to the line, America's leading taxpayer advocate, and of course, been contrasting the differences between the two presidential candidates on taxes. Certainly want to get an update from you on that important point, and also the jobs report out today, revising the previous two jobs report we just discussed with our prominent local economist here. Give us your view of things here at the moment, Grover Norquist.
Yes, it wasn't one bad month's report. It was three, because they went back and said, those previous 2 months where we said there were certain months, 100,000 jobs we said were created weren't actually. So revised those down. And then this month, 12,000 net jobs. Now, during the Reagan period of growth, 300,000 a month was normal. This was 12,000. And of the 12,000, there were 40,000 government jobs, which means in the real economy, the people who pay taxes, the people who actually create wealth, there were fewer of them with jobs. The reason they had 12,000 up is that 40,000 government jobs were created, and this has been a repeated history. The Biden administration is creating temporary government jobs and killing real, permanent, sustainable jobs.
You do a great job keeping track of all this. We're on the air live with Grover Norquist, the president of Americans for Tax Reform, and a lot of those government jobs happen to be IRS agents, right?
Yes, $80 billion worth and coming, thanks to the single vote of Kamala Harris, the vice president. She cast a deciding vote for the legislation that did massive spending that gave us so much of our inflation. She did do something as vice president. She created that inflation. But then she also said, let's take $80 billion, and the bill she passed took $80 billion to give to the IRS. And you may have been under the impression they were going to hire people to answer phones. The inspector general did some tests. There's 76 different phone numbers that the IRS has that you can call and supposedly get talked to. Of the 76, only 2 had a live person answer the phone. A whole bunch of them simply went to voicemail. Some of them didn't work at all. And some of them said, we'd love to send you to voicemail, but it's filled up. Goodbye. That's what the $80 billion is getting. Luckily, they are finding some way to spend it. They're running ads in all 50 states. They want 360 armed agents, people with guns. And the advertisement says, must be willing to utilize force, including lethal force if necessary. Now, what kind of a job says, first you have to be willing to shoot fellow Americans? The IRS has a bunch of guns, several thousand, millions of rounds of ammunition, which makes you wonder what they're doing. Much too much ammunition for the number of guns they have. They have more guns than they have people who are trained in them. And again, the inspector general, that looks to see whether what the government's actually doing, found that people with the guns in the IRS have not been doing the training. When they find that they've not been doing the training, they're not denied the gun to carry around with them. There's no reason an IRS agent should ever have a gun. If you want to go visit somebody, the IRS sends you letters. The IRS goes to your bank and debits your account. Okay, they don't show up at your house and repossess your car. But if for some reason you felt you did have something there, you go to the local police and ask them to accompany you. You don't need armed IRS agents. And in something that's not funny, it's sick and sad and depressing. One of the IRS agents, more than half the time the IRS has pulled the trigger in the last 3 years, more than half the time it was by mistake. These people are not trained. They don't know what they're doing. And one IRS agent killed another because he had his gun out while he was fiddling with his iPhone and shot the guy. This is teenagers at the rifle range know not to do that. This is unacceptable, dangerous, and they have too much money and they should not be doing it, arming people that they say, first thing you have to do is be willing to shoot your fellow Americans.
That is heartbreaking, and thanks for highlighting that. And this so-called Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of people think that's a misnomer, of course, given what's happened with inflation. And has this now fully kicked in, and are we stuck with this, or might that be revisited at some point?
Well, I think if we elect a Republican president, House, and Senate, much of that will be repealed because it's a whole bunch of spending. Some of it's happened, others threaten to happen. We can take that and say, we're not going to spend that money. That doesn't have to happen. You could do that through reconciliation with a simple majority in the House and Senate. You don't have to have a filibuster. Again, the idea that because the inflation made everything in the country on average 20% more expensive over 3 years, and that the day-to-day inflation is not growing as fast as it used to, that doesn't mean it's gone away. That the $100 bill in your pocket is worth $80, and every day it's worth a little less than $80 because inflation is not as rapid as it was in year 1, 2, and 3. A lower inflation rate does not mean things are getting better. It means things are getting worse less slowly than the first 3 years. This is not something to celebrate.
And, of course, housing inflation, a very big issue. We just had a big discussion about that earlier this hour. And unfortunately, the homeless crisis continues here in the Los Angeles area, with affordable housing being a huge issue, with housing costs skyrocketing. I remember, of course, you worked closely with President Reagan back in the 80s to create Americans for Tax Reform. And remember, one of the bank slogans back then was Americans want to succeed, not just survive. Now you can practically flip it. Americans want to survive and not just succeed, right, given the current environment.
Look, it is a problem. It can be turned around. It can be fixed. But we have too much regulation, and Kamala Harris says we need more. Trump says we need less. We have taxes that are too high, and Kamala says you haven't seen nothing yet. She wants to bring in a second death tax, to take the capital gains tax up much higher than China's or Europe's, for crying out loud, to take the corporate rate up higher than Europe. So we tax American businesses higher than Europe, higher than China. She wishes to make us uncompetitive with the rest of the world. How do we expect to succeed in world competition with that amount of damage at the very beginning of everybody's job? That is something we cannot afford to do. And Trump had made a whole bunch of good moves when he was president in terms of taking rates down.
Grover, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll be back in touch with you next week. Presidential election, of course, coming up on Tuesday. That is Grover Norquist, president of Americans for Tax Reform, live with us here on Mottek On Money on 790 KABC.
Best-selling author and business growth expert Candy Valentino brings her unique spin on achieving financial freedom.
More than 70% of people feel some sense of imposter syndrome in their life. So that when feelings of fraudulency arise, remind yourself of who you are. Make sure that you recognize and celebrate small milestones. Practicing this will really shift your focus from seeking perfectionism to really acknowledging progress.
The Candy Valentino Podcast, wherever you listen.